The shuttle descended through thick orange clouds, and Amy Cole pressed her face against the small window to watch the alien world appear below her. She had never seen anything quite like it before, and her heart beat a little faster with excitement rather than fear. The planet Vareth 9 stretched out beneath the spacecraft like a painting made by someone who had never seen Earth. Purple forests covered the hills, and silver rivers cut through valleys of red stone, and in the distance she could see the massive structures of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy, rising from the landscape like monuments to warfare itself. Amy was 28 years old, and she came from a small town in Colorado, where the mountains touched the sky, and the winters could kill you if you were not careful. She had joined the military at 18, and worked her way up through the ranks with patience and determination. And now she sat alone in a shuttle full of aliens who refused to look at her. She was the first human ever admitted to the Deathworld simulation program. The other cadets on the shuttle were massive creatures from worlds she had only read about in briefing documents. There was a Kethvari warrior with green scales and yellow eyes who stood nearly 8 feet tall, and there were 3 Bravani soldiers built like walking tanks with 4 arms each, and there was a delicate insectoid Kyrix whose wings folded neatly against its back. None of them spoke to her, and that was fine, because Amy had learned long ago that respect was earned and not given. The shuttle landed with a gentle thump, and the doors slid open to reveal a hot, humid world that smelled like copper and rain. Amy grabbed her standard military duffel bag and stepped out onto alien soil for the first time in her life. And she took a deep breath and decided that the air tasted strange, but not unpleasant. A crowd of alien cadets had already gathered on the landing platform, and they turned to stare at her as she walked down the ramp. Whispers spread through the group like ripples in water, and she caught fragments of their conversations. Is that the human? So small and fragile-looking. Why would the Coalition waste resources on a prey species? Amy ignored them all and walked toward the registration building with her bag over her shoulder. She had heard worse things from drill sergeants back on Earth, and alien gossip did not bother her in the slightest. Inside the building, she found a processing station staffed by a bored-looking Tellurian with 4 arms and pale blue skin. The alien looked up at her and blinked all 6 of its eyes in surprise. "Human," the Tellurian said, checking something on a glowing screen. "Lieutenant Amy Cole, Earth System Defense Force, transferred to Coalition Academy for Deathworld simulation training. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Amy replied with a polite nod. The Tellurian handed her a datapad and a room assignment and a schedule that made her eyebrows rise slightly. The training would begin at dawn, and the first simulation would last 72 hours without rest. "Your roommate is already waiting for you," the Tellurian said. "Cadet Prex, also Tellurian, Building 7, Room 442. Amy thanked the administrator and made her way across the campus. The academy was enormous and beautiful in a strange alien way, with buildings that curved like seashells and pathways that glowed faintly in the fading light. She found Building 7 and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor and knocked on the door of Room 442. It slid open to reveal a Tellurian who stood about 6 feet tall with 4 arms and the same pale blue skin as the administrator, but with kind eyes that held curiosity instead of contempt. "You must be the human," the Tellurian said. "I am Prex, and I suppose we will be living together for the duration of the program, assuming either of us survives that long." "Amy Cole," she replied, stepping inside and setting her bag on the empty bed. "Nice to meet you, Prex." The room was small but functional, with 2 beds and 2 desks, and a window that looked out over the purple forest. Amy began unpacking her things, while Prex watched with obvious fascination. "I have to warn you," Prex said carefully. The dropout rate for this program is 60%, and no species from a world classified below Class 3 has ever completed it. Earth is listed as a Class 2 temperate world, and the instructors will not make things easy for you. Amy pulled out a small photograph of her family and set it on her desk. Her parents stood in front of their cabin in the mountains, with snow falling around them and smiles on their faces. "I appreciate the warning," she said. "What can you tell me about the instructors?" Prex sat down on the edge of the bed, and all four hands fidgeted nervously. "The senior instructor is Zorath, a Kethvari veteran who has been running this program for 30 years. He believes that only species from true Deathworlds deserve to be elite soldiers, and he has made it very clear that he thinks humans are soft creatures who do not belong here." Amy nodded and continued unpacking. She pulled out a small container of protein bars and a water bottle and a compact first aid kit that she had packed herself. "What about the other cadets?" she asked. 40 of us in total," Prex replied. "Mostly Kethvari and Bravani, with a few Chirics and some others. I am here because my family has a military tradition, and I wanted to prove myself, but honestly I am terrified." Amy looked at her new roommate and saw genuine fear in those 6 eyes. She remembered feeling the same way on her first day of basic training back on Earth, when the drill sergeants had screamed in her face and told her she would never make it. "Fear is normal," Amy said gently. "It keeps you alert and careful. The trick is not letting it control you." Prex seemed comforted by her words, and they spent the next hour talking about their homes and their families and their reasons for joining the program. Amy learned that Tellurians came from a mild world with gentle weather, and that Prex had never experienced temperatures below freezing or above 30 degrees. When night fell, Amy set her alarm for an hour before dawn and climbed into bed. Prex asked her if she was nervous about the first simulation. "A little," Amy admitted, "but mostly I am curious to see what they consider dangerous. I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, where the winters can drop to -30, and the summers bring flash floods and forest fires, and the wildlife includes bears and mountain lions and venomous snakes." "And you call that a Class 2 world?" the Tellurian whispered. Amy smiled and closed her eyes and fell asleep within minutes, because tomorrow would be a long day, and she had learned to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. The next morning she woke before her alarm and dressed in her training uniform, and made her way to the assembly field, where the other cadets had already gathered. The twin suns of Vareth 9 were just rising over the purple forest, and the air was thick with moisture and the smell of alien flowers. Senior Instructor Zorath stood on a raised platform at the front of the assembly, and he was even more impressive in person than Prex had described. His scales gleamed like polished emeralds, and his yellow eyes swept across the gathered cadets with cold calculation. "Welcome to the Deathworld simulation program," Zorath announced in a voice that carried across the field without effort. "Over the next 6 weeks, you will face the most hostile environments in known space, and most of you will fail. This is by design, because the Coalition only needs the best of the best." His eyes found Amy in the crowd, and his lip curled in what might have been disgust. "I see we have a human among us this year," he continued. "A species from a soft temperate garden world, who somehow convinced the Coalition to waste a training slot on her. I predict she will not last 3 days." Every alien in the assembly turned to look at Amy, and she felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She could have been angry, or embarrassed, or defensive, but instead she simply raised her hand. Zorath's eyes narrowed. "What is it, human?" "Sir," Amy asked calmly, "where is the cafeteria? I did not have time for breakfast this morning." The silence that followed was absolute, and Prex looked at her like she had lost her mind, and even Zorath seemed momentarily stunned by her complete lack of concern. But Amy was simply hungry, and she had learned long ago that facing challenges on an empty stomach was never a good idea. The Deathworld training could wait until after she had eaten a proper meal. The dropship screamed through the atmosphere, and Amy gripped the safety harness as the vehicle shook violently around her. Through the small window, she could see nothing but fire and smoke as they descended toward the surface of the simulated world below. Instructor Zorath had explained the rules before they departed. The cadets would be dropped onto a holographic recreation of Kethvar Prime, the homeworld of the reptilian Kethvari species, and they would need to survive for 72 hours while establishing a base camp and defending themselves against the hostile environment. The simulation was so advanced that it felt completely real. The gravity, the air, the temperature, and even the predatory creatures that roamed the landscape were perfect recreations that could cause genuine pain and exhaustion, even though they could not actually kill. Amy had listened carefully to the briefing and learned that Kethvar Prime had gravity at 1.4 times Earth's standard, and an atmosphere with pockets of toxic gas, and wildlife that considered anything smaller than a ground car to be potential food. The other cadets had looked nervous, and several had already begun to sweat with fear, but Amy had simply nodded and made a mental note to watch her step. Now the dropship hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact, and the rear doors flew open to reveal a hellish landscape of black rock and red vegetation under a sky the color of bruised flesh. The heat hit Amy like a physical force, and she immediately began to sweat through her uniform. "Move, move, move," Zorath's voice crackled through their communication devices. "You have 60 seconds to clear the landing zone before the first predator sweep begins." The 40 cadets scrambled out of the dropship and scattered across the rocky terrain. Amy moved with the group, but kept her eyes on the environment around her, and noticed things that others missed. The red vegetation grew thicker near certain rock formations, which suggested water sources beneath the surface. The wind carried a faint sulfurous smell that indicated volcanic activity somewhere nearby. The ground was covered with tracks from large creatures that moved on 6 legs. Within the first hour, 5 cadets collapsed from the gravity strain. Their bodies simply could not handle the constant crushing weight that pressed down on every muscle and bone, and they had to be extracted from the simulation in medical pods. Amy felt the gravity too, but she had spent her childhood hiking in the mountains at high altitude, where the air was thin and every step required extra effort. Her body knew how to work harder when the conditions demanded it. 3 more cadets fell when a simulated apex predator burst from the vegetation and charged the group. It was a massive beast with armored scales and teeth like daggers and eyes that burned with artificial hunger. The creature was not real, but the fear it inspired certainly was, and 3 cadets simply froze in terror and could not move, even when the beast's jaws closed around them. They were extracted immediately, their minds too traumatized to continue. Amy had dodged to the side when the creature appeared and watched it carefully as it attacked the others. She noticed that it favored its left leg and moved slower when it turned in that direction, a weakness that might prove useful later. The remaining 32 cadets regrouped in a small valley and began arguing about what to do next. The Kethvari cadets wanted to push forward and find high ground, while the Bravani preferred to dig in and build defensive positions. Amy ignored the argument and began gathering firewood. Prex appeared at her side with a confused expression across all 6 eyes. "What are you doing?" the Tellurian asked. "We need to decide on a strategy." "We need fire," Amy replied simply. "Fire means warmth when the temperature drops at night, and fire means protection against predators, and fire means the ability to boil water and cook food. Everything else comes after that." Prex considered her words and then began helping her collect dry branches and fallen vegetation. Soon several other cadets noticed what they were doing and joined them, abandoning the useless argument that was going nowhere. An hour later, they had a decent pile of fuel, and Amy pulled a small piece of metal from her boot. She had hidden it there before the simulation began, because she knew that the standard survival kits they were given did not include fire-starting equipment. Using the metal and a piece of flint she found among the rocks, she created sparks that caught on dry grass, and soon a small fire crackled in the center of their makeshift camp. The Ketvari cadets stared at her with something that might have been respect. "How did you know to bring that?" one of them asked. "I grew up in a place where winter can kill you in hours if you are not prepared," Amy said, feeding the fire with larger sticks. "You learn to always carry what you need." The first day passed slowly, and the cadets worked together to build a rough shelter from fallen branches and broad leaves. The gravity made every task exhausting, and by nightfall, everyone was ready to collapse. Everyone except Amy, who sat by the fire and pulled a sealed container from her pack. Prex watched in disbelief as the human opened the container and revealed a simple sandwich made of bread and meat and vegetables. "You brought food?" the Tellurian gasped. "I made it this morning before we left," Amy said, taking a bite. "The ration packs they give us are designed for emergency nutrition, but they taste terrible. I figured a good meal would help keep my spirits up." She offered half the sandwich to Prex, who accepted it with trembling hands. Up in the observation deck, Instructor Zorath watched the monitors with a frown carved deep into his scaled face. The human's vital signs were elevated but stable, and her performance metrics were among the highest in the entire group. Lieutenant Mira, his Chiric's assistant, clicked her mandibles nervously. "The human is adapting faster than expected," she observed. "Her body seems unusually suited to high-gravity environments." "Luck," Zorath growled. "Nothing more. The real tests have not even begun yet." But even as he said the words, he felt a small seed of doubt taking root in his mind. The next morning brought new challenges. The simulation introduced toxic gas pockets that drifted through the valley, and several cadets inhaled the fumes before they realized the danger. Amy had noticed the discoloration in the air and held her breath while running to higher ground. She grabbed Prex by two of the Tellurian's arms and dragged her roommate along behind her. 7 more cadets were extracted with respiratory damage, and the group shrank to 25. By noon, the heat had become unbearable, and the cadets huddled in whatever shade they could find. The twin suns of the simulated world beat down on them without mercy, and dehydration became a serious concern. Amy remembered something her father had taught her during a camping trip in the Utah desert. She dug a small hole in the ground and placed a container at the bottom, and covered the hole with a piece of flexible material from her survival kit. "What is that supposed to do?" a Bravani cadet asked skeptically. "Solar still," Amy explained. "The sun heats the ground, and moisture evaporates from the soil and collects on the underside of the covering before dripping into the container. It is slow, but it works." By evening, she had collected enough water to share with Prex and 2 other cadets who had watched her technique and tried to replicate it. The second day brought predators in larger numbers. The simulation was designed to escalate, and now packs of 6-legged hunters prowled the edges of their camp. During one attack, a venomous creature lunged from the underbrush directly at Amy. She did not scream or panic, but instead sidestepped the strike with practiced ease and grabbed a forked branch and pinned the creature to the ground before it could bite her. The other cadets stared in shock. "On Earth, we have rattlesnakes," Amy said calmly, releasing the creature and watching it slither away. "They hide in the rocks and strike without warning. You learn to watch where you step and how to react when things go wrong." That night, she ate another sandwich by the fire while chaos erupted around her. Predators howled in the darkness, and toxic gas clouds drifted through distant valleys, and the ground shook with what might have been volcanic tremors. Prex sat beside her and shook with fear and exhaustion. "How are you so calm?" the Tellurian demanded. "This world is trying to kill us." Amy looked up at the strange stars and thought about home. The blizzards that buried her town every winter, and the floods that swept through the valleys every spring, and the wildfires that turned the summer sky orange with smoke. "This is difficult," she admitted, "but I'd have seen worse." Prex did not understand what she meant, and Amy did not try to explain. Some things had to be experienced to be believed. The weeks that followed pushed every cadet to their absolute limit, and Amy watched the numbers dwindle with each new simulation. 22 remained after the first week, and then 18 survived the second week. And by the middle of the third week, only 12 cadets were still standing. Each simulation was worse than the last, and Instructor Zorath seemed determined to find the breaking point of every species in the program. The frozen methane storms of Brixis 4 came first. The cadets were dropped onto an ice world where the temperature dropped to -100 degrees, and the wind carried frozen crystals that could shred exposed skin in seconds. Most of the alien cadets had never experienced true cold before. Their homeworlds were warm places where snow was nothing more than a legend, and ice only existed in drinks. Amy built a shelter within the first hour. She had learned the technique from her grandfather, who had survived a blizzard in Alaska by digging into a snowbank and using his own body heat to create a survivable pocket of warmth. The same principle worked on Brixis 4, even though the snow was made of frozen methane instead of water. Prex huddled beside her inside the shelter, and marveled at how the small space stayed warm enough to keep them alive. "Your world has places like this?" the Tellurian asked, through chattering teeth. "Colorado gets cold in winter," Amy said. "Not this cold, but cold enough to kill you if you make mistakes. My father taught me how to survive in the snow when I was 7 years old." 3 cadets were extracted with severe frostbite, and one Chirix's wings shattered from the cold. The insectoid screamed in agony as medical personnel rushed to save what remained of the delicate membranes. Amy felt sorry for the Chirix, but she could not afford to dwell on the losses. Survival required focus, and focus required pushing emotion aside until the danger passed. The volcanic hellscape of Infernal Reach came next, and this simulation tested the cadets in completely different ways. The ground was hot enough to burn through standard boots, and rivers of molten rock flowed through valleys that had seemed safe just moments before. Amy navigated the lava fields by reading the color of the rocks beneath her feet. She had learned this technique while hiking near active volcanoes in Hawaii during a family vacation, and the knowledge saved her life more than once during the simulation. "Dark rock is cooler," she explained to the surviving cadets who followed her across the treacherous terrain. "Bright orange or red means the heat is still rising from below. Stick to the black and gray surfaces, and you will be fine." 2 more cadets fell into hidden lava tubes and had to be extracted with severe burns. The group shrank to 10. The Scorched Expanse was perhaps the worst simulation yet. A high-radiation wasteland where the very air seemed to glow with deadly energy, and every breath carried microscopic particles that could destroy living tissue from the inside out. Most alien species had evolved on worlds with thick atmospheres or magnetic fields that protected them from radiation. Their bodies simply could not handle the invisible assault that came from every direction. Amy wrapped herself in reflective material and kept moving while others collapsed around her. She knew that motion was key, because staying in one place meant absorbing more radiation, while moving meant spreading the exposure across time. The Kethvari cadets struggled most in this simulation, despite their reputation as Deathworld natives. Their homeworld had high gravity and dangerous predators, but its atmosphere blocked most harmful radiation. Only 8 cadets completed the Scorched Expanse simulation, and Amy was one of them. That night, Prex sat with her in their quarters and asked the question that had been building for weeks. "How do you do it?" the Tellurian demanded with frustration and admiration mixed in equal parts. "Every simulation breaks someone, and every challenge defeats another species, but you just keep going like it is nothing special." Amy thought carefully before answering. because she had been asking herself the same question. "I grew up in a place where nature was always trying to kill me," she finally said. "Flash floods in the canyons, lightning strikes on the mountain peaks, hypothermia in the winter, heat stroke in the summer, bears in the forests, rattlesnakes in the rocks, and more ways to die than I could count. Surrounded by snow-covered mountains. I got lost in Death Valley once, during a family trip when I was 12. I wandered off the trail and could not find my way back, and spent 2 days alone in the desert with nothing but a water bottle and a pocket knife." Prex's eyes widened in horror. 2 days? How did you survive?" "I found shade during the day, and traveled at night when it was cooler. I found water by following animal tracks to a hidden spring. I ate insects and cactus fruit, because I knew they were safe from reading about desert survival in books." The Tellurian shook her head slowly. "Your parents let you read books about survival? On my world, children read stories about peaceful gardens and gentle weather. No one teaches us how to survive, because survival is not supposed to be difficult." Amy smiled sadly, because she understood something that Prex did not. On Earth, survival is always difficult. The weather changes without warning. The ground shakes and splits open. The oceans rise up in massive waves, and the wildlife considers us food. We learn to adapt because adaptation is the only way to live. In the observation deck, Instructor Zorath had begun to feel genuinely unsettled by the humans' performance. He had designed these simulations to break the strongest warriors in the galaxy, and this small, soft-looking creature from a supposedly gentle world was passing them all. He summoned Lieutenant Mira and Sergeant Cole to a private meeting. "I want a full analysis of the human homeworld," he ordered. "Not the summary in her file, but the complete environmental data from Coalition archives." Mira tilted her head curiously. "You suspect the initial classification was wrong?" "I suspect nothing," Zorath growled, "but I need to understand how a prey species from a garden world is outperforming cadets from Class 4 Deathworlds." Sergeant Cole, a massive Bravani with muscles like steel cables, spoke up with unusual hesitation. "I have watched the human closely during the simulations," he said. "She moves like a predator, calm and patient, and always watching for threats. I have only seen that kind of awareness in species that evolved surrounded by danger." Zorath dismissed them both and stared at the monitors showing the sleeping human. She looked so ordinary with her soft skin and small frame, but something about her made the veteran instructor deeply uncomfortable. The next morning brought the announcement that the penultimate challenge would begin in 48 hours. The cadets would face a simulation of Nexar 7, officially classified as a Class 5 Deathworld. Prex turned pale blue with fear when she heard the news. "Class 5, she whispered. "That is one step below completely uninhabitable. Species have gone extinct on Class 5 worlds." Amy nodded and began checking her equipment. "Then we will need to be very careful," she said calmly. The other surviving cadets gathered around her almost unconsciously. Somewhere along the way, the human had become their unofficial leader, and none of them questioned it anymore. She assigned tasks and reviewed survival strategies, and made sure everyone had proper supplies. Her voice was steady, and her hands were sure, and her eyes showed no fear. When Prex asked how she could stay so calm before a Class 5 simulation, Amy just shrugged. "Worrying does not change anything," she said. "The challenge will come whether I fear it or not. Better to prepare than to panic." That night she made another sandwich, and ate it while reviewing maps of the Nexar 7 environment. The other cadets watched her with something close to wonder. The human was strange and surprising, and absolutely impossible to understand. But they were very glad she was on their side. The Nexar 7 simulation began at dawn, and Amy knew immediately that this challenge would be different from everything that came before. The environment was hostile in ways that seemed almost personal, as if the planet itself wanted them dead. The 8 surviving cadets landed in a valley surrounded by mountains that looked like broken teeth against a sickly yellow sky. The temperature shifted wildly between burning heat and freezing cold, depending on whether clouds covered the distant sun. Electromagnetic storms crackled across the horizon and sent painful shocks through any exposed metal. Amy dropped her standard equipment immediately and switched to the backup gear she had prepared using non-conductive materials. 2 cadets who kept their metal tools screamed in agony when lightning struck nearby and the electrical surge traveled through their belongings. The carnivorous flora was the next threat they encountered. Plants that looked innocent enough until you stepped too close, and then vines would snap out with incredible speed to drag victims toward tooth-lined pods that served as digestive chambers. Amy recognized the pattern within the first hour. The plants only attacked when they sensed body heat and movement together, so she taught the others to move slowly and steadily, without sudden motions that would trigger the hunting response. "How do you know these things?" a HFY cadet named Sorn demanded, with exhaustion in his voice. "On Earth we have plants that eat insects and small animals," Amy explained. "Venus flytraps and pitcher plants and sundews, they all use similar methods to detect and capture prey. I figured the principle would be the same, even if the scale is different." Sorn stared at her with yellow eyes that held a new kind of respect. "Your world has predatory plants and predatory fungi and parasitic worms and bacteria that can kill you in hours," Amy replied. "Earth is not a gentle place." 3 more cadets dropped out during the first day. 1 was caught by the carnivorous plants, despite Amy's warnings. 1 suffered a nervous breakdown from the constant electromagnetic interference that made their communication devices scream with static. And 1 simply gave up and called for extraction. 5 cadets remained: Amy, Prex, Sorn the HFY, a Bravani named Tull, and a Chyrix named Vess. The pack-hunting predators appeared on the second night. They were nightmarish creatures with 6 legs and bodies covered in bony plates and mouths filled with teeth that dripped with neurotoxic venom. They moved in perfect coordination, communicating through clicks and whistles that echoed through the darkness. Amy organized the defense with calm efficiency. She assigned watch positions and built a perimeter of thorned branches that she had collected during the day, and created noise traps using small stones and strips of fabric that would alert them if anything approached. The predators tested their defenses throughout the night, but never committed to a full attack. They were intelligent enough to recognize that the prey was prepared and patient enough to wait for a better opportunity. "On Earth, we call this stalking behavior," Amy whispered to the others during a quiet moment. "Wolves and lions do the same thing. They watch and wait and look for weakness. The key is to never show them any." Dawn brought relief, but also new challenges. The water sources were contaminated with chemicals that would kill most species within hours of consumption, and food was nearly impossible to find in the hostile landscape. Amy used her knowledge of survival techniques to locate safe water by watching where certain insects gathered. Any creature that could survive in this environment had already solved the problem of finding clean water, and following them was faster than testing every source manually. She also identified several plants that might be edible by observing which ones the local wildlife avoided. The logic was counterintuitive but effective, because animals on dangerous worlds learned to avoid the deadliest plants, which meant the ones they did eat were probably safe. Prex watched her prepare a small meal from gathered vegetation, and could not help but ask the question, "Did they teach you this in human military training?" Amy laughed softly. "My grandmother taught me most of this. She grew up during hard times, when people had to find food wherever they could. And she passed the knowledge down to my mother, who passed it to me. On Earth, we call it foraging." High above in the observation deck, Lieutenant Mira approached Instructor Zorath with a data tablet clutched in her clawed hands. Her compound eyes reflected the glow of the screens, and her mandibles clicked with obvious nervousness. "Sir," she said quietly, "I have completed the analysis you requested." Zorath turned away from the monitors, showing the human calmly eating her lunch, while a Class 5 Deathworld raged around her. "Report." Mira handed him the tablet and waited in silence as he read the contents. She watched his scales shift color, from confident green to uncertain yellow, to something close to pale gray. "This cannot be correct," he finally said. "I've verified the data 3 times through independent sources," Mira replied. "The Coalition's initial classification of Earth was based on limited surveys that only examined temperate regions during mild weather conditions. The full environmental analysis tells a very different story." Zorath read the report again, and felt his certainty crumbling with every word. Earth had gravity at 1 full standard, which was higher than 60% of inhabited worlds in the Coalition. What seemed normal to humans was crushing weight to most galactic species. Earth's atmosphere contained 21% oxygen, a highly reactive and corrosive gas that would poison or burn the respiratory systems of countless alien species. Humans breathed this toxic mixture every moment of their lives without even noticing. Earth experienced constant tectonic activity, with earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occurring somewhere on the planet almost continuously. The ground itself was unstable and unpredictable. Earth's weather systems included hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards and monsoons and droughts, any one of which would qualify as a natural disaster on most civilized worlds. Humans built their cities in the paths of these storms and simply rebuilt when destruction came. Earth's wildlife included apex predators on every continent, venomous creatures numbering in the tens of thousands of species, parasites that could destroy a body from within, and microscopic pathogens capable of killing within hours. Humans shared their world with more ways to die than most species could imagine. The final classification made Zorath's blood run cold. Earth registered as a Class 4.7 Deathworld. Not a garden world, not a temperate paradise, but a genuine high-classification Deathworld that was only marginally less hostile than the Nexar 7 simulation currently trying to kill the human and her companions. "They evolved there," Mira said quietly. "Humans are not prey species from a safe world. They are Deathworld natives who have survived extinction-level events multiple times in their history. Ice ages and supervolcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts and plague outbreaks that killed significant portions of their population." Zorath looked back at the monitors. Amy Cole sat on a rock eating something she had prepared from local vegetation, while electromagnetic storms crackled overhead, and predators circled in the distance, and her 4 companions huddled close to her for protection and guidance. She looked completely relaxed. She looked like she was having lunch on a pleasant afternoon back home. Because to her, this was not much worse than a difficult camping trip. Zorath felt something he had not experienced in 30 years of military service, something he thought he had lost the capacity to feel after surviving 3 wars and countless battles on the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy. He felt afraid, not of the human personally, but of what she represented. An entire species of Deathworld survivors who had been dismissed as soft and weak because they did not look dangerous and did not brag about their homeworld's hostility. How many other species had the Coalition underestimated? How many potential allies or enemies had been ignored because their appearance did not match their capabilities? Sergeant Cole entered the observation room and noticed the pale color of his commander's scales. "Sir, is something wrong?" Zorath handed him the data tablet without a word. The massive Bravani read the report, and his 4 arms went slack with shock. "This changes everything," Cole whispered. "Yes," Zorath agreed, watching the human finish her meal and begin preparing her companions for the next stage of the simulation. "It does." The final challenge was announced on a gray morning when clouds hung low over the academy and rain fell in sheets that turned the training grounds into rivers of mud. Instructor Zorath stood before the 5 surviving cadets with an expression that Amy could not quite read. "You have proven yourselves in simulations," he said, his voice carrying across the assembly field despite the storm. "But the last test will be different. You will be deployed to the surface of Varath 9's southern continent, a genuine Class 3 Deathworld zone used for advanced training." Prex made a small sound of fear, and Soren's scales shifted to a nervous yellow, and even Tull the Bravani seemed to shrink slightly at the announcement. Amy simply nodded and began mentally reviewing her supplies. "You will have 72 hours to reach an extraction point 200 kilometers away," Zorath continued. "Minimal supplies, no communication with the Academy, and no possibility of early extraction. You succeed, or you die." He paused and looked directly at Amy with eyes that held something different than the contempt she had seen at the beginning of the program. "The environment is real," he said quietly. "The dangers are real. I suggest you take this seriously." "I always do, sir," Amy replied. The dropship deposited them in a valley choked with alien vegetation that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The air was thick and hot, and smelled like rotting fruit, and the sounds of unknown creatures echoed from every direction. Amy took point without being asked, and the others fell into formation behind her. Somewhere along the way she had become their leader, and none of them questioned it anymore. The first day was grueling. The terrain shifted from dense jungle to rocky highlands to swampy lowlands without warning, and every environment brought new dangers. Soren broke his leg on the second morning when a hidden crevice gave way beneath his feet. The Kethvari warrior screamed in pain as his bones snapped, and Amy was at his side within seconds. "We need to leave him," Vess said, the Chirix's voice cold with pragmatic calculation. "He cannot walk, and we cannot carry him 200 kilometers. "We are not leaving anyone," Amy replied firmly. "Help me find straight branches and something to bind them together." She fashioned a splint from local materials, using techniques her mother had taught her during wilderness first aid training. The work was quick and efficient, and within an hour Soren could hobble along with support from Tull's massive frame. On the second day, Tull drank from a stream that looked clean but was contaminated with fungal spores. Within hours he developed a fever, and his skin began to mottle with spreading infection. Amy examined the surrounding vegetation and found a plant with thick leaves that oozed a sticky sap when broken. She remembered reading about similar plants on Earth that had natural antibiotic properties and decided to take a chance. She applied the sap to Tull's infection and made him drink tea brewed from the leaves. "How do you know this will work?" Prex asked nervously. "I do not know for certain," Amy admitted. "But on Earth we discovered most of our medicines by observing which plants help sick animals recover. Biology follows patterns, and I am betting this world is similar enough for the principle to apply." By morning, Tull's fever had broken, and the infection was receding. Vess suffered the worst injury on the third day, when a sudden temperature drop caused her exoskeleton to crack along the joints. The Chirix could barely move without her shell splitting further, and every step brought whimpers of pain. Amy found a tree that produced thick amber-colored resin and heated it over a small fire until it became soft and pliable. She used the warm resin to seal Vess's shell cracks, creating a temporary but effective repair that allowed the Chirix to continue. "You saved all of us," Vess said quietly as Amy worked. "Without you, we would have died on the first day." "You would have found a way to survive," Amy replied. "Intelligent beings are good at that." "No," Vess insisted. "We would have panicked and made mistakes and died. You kept us calm and showed us how to face problems instead of fearing them." Amy did not know how to respond to that, so she simply finished her work and helped Vess to her feet. They reached the extraction point with 4 hours to spare. 5 exhausted cadets stumbled out of the wilderness, and collapsed on the landing pad, where medical personnel immediately began treating their injuries. Instructor Zorath was waiting for them. He stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the human who had just led 4 alien cadets through a genuine Deathworld environment and kept every single one of them alive. "Lieutenant Cole," he finally said, "I owe you an apology." Amy blinked in surprise. That was not what she had expected. "When you arrived, I called you a soft creature from a garden world," Zorath continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame. "I predicted you would not last 3 days. I was wrong." He pulled out a data tablet and showed her the information that Lieutenant Mira had compiled. "Earth is not a Class 2 temperate world," he said. "Earth is a Class 4.7 death world, and humans are not prey species. You are survivors who evolved in conditions that would kill most galactic species within hours." Amy read the data and felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in her homeworld, sadness that her people's strength had been so badly misunderstood, and a quiet satisfaction that she had proven herself through actions rather than words. "I grew up knowing that nature could kill me at any moment," she said softly. "Blizzards and floods and wildfires, and earthquakes and predators and diseases. We learned to adapt, because adaptation is the only way to survive on Earth." Zorath nodded slowly. "I understand that now." The graduation ceremony took place 1 week later in the grand auditorium of the Academy. Hundreds of cadets and faculty members gathered to witness the completion of the most difficult training program in the Coalition military. Zorath stood at the podium and addressed the crowd. "This year, 5 cadets completed the Deathworld simulation program," he announced. "Prex of Telluria, Sorn of Kethvar Prime, Tull of Bravani, Ves of Chirix, and Lieutenant Amy Cole of Earth." Murmurs spread through the audience at the mention of a human. "I must also share something that I have learned," Zorath continued. "Earth is not the garden world we believed it to be. Full environmental analysis reveals it to be a Class 4.7 death world, making humans one of the most naturally resilient species in known space." The auditorium fell completely silent. "Lieutenant Cole achieved the highest scores in the history of this program," Zorath said. "Not because she is exceptional among her kind, but because her kind is exceptional. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day, and they thrived." He turned to face Amy directly. "I am offering you a position as assistant instructor for future Deathworld training courses. The Coalition needs to understand what humans can teach us about survival." Amy stood and accepted the offer with a firm handshake that made Zorath wince slightly at the strength of her grip. After the ceremony, a young cadet from a Class 1 Paradise world approached her nervously. He was small and delicate, and his eyes were wide, with something between fear and fascination. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Is it true what the instructor said about humans? Are you really that dangerous?" Amy smiled warmly and reached into her bag. She pulled out a sandwich she had made that morning and offered half to the young cadet. "We are not dangerous," she said gently. "We are just used to things being hard. It makes everything else feel manageable." The cadet took the sandwich and bit into it tentatively. "It is good," he said with surprise. "Thank you. I made it myself." They stood together in comfortable silence and watched the other cadets celebrate their graduation. Amy thought about her home and her family and the mountains that had taught her how to be strong. Tomorrow she would begin her new role as an instructor, and she would teach the next generation of cadets how to survive on worlds that wanted them dead. But for now, she was content to share a simple meal with a new friend and enjoy the quiet moment of peace that came after a hard journey was finally complete. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of hostile worlds and deadly challenges. But humans had been facing dangerous places since they first climbed down from the trees and learned to walk upright across the plains of their Deathworld home. They would keep surviving because that was what they did best, and Amy Cole was very good at being human.